All right, guys. So, as the prospects for a ceasefire in Gaza seem as far away as ever, Israel is obviously continuing with their ongoing offensive not only in Gaza, but also now in the West Bank as well. So, here's some of the latest. They say from the Associated Press an Israeli strike on a Palestinian tent camp kills at least 19, and this seems to be somewhat of an undercount given some of the testimony and images coming out from people on the ground. Now, this is a headline that you could probably safely run on any given day over the last 11 months of this genocide. We have seen time and time again the IDF strike schools and mosques and churches and refugee camps and UN shelters and residential buildings, farmland, water infrastructure. We've seen them target aid workers and journalists. This is something that has unfortunately become the norm in Gaza. Now, this particular strike, you can see some of the images of it here with these massive craters, children sitting nearby. We'll get to more of those images here in a minute. But this particular strike took place in Mawasi, which is supposed to be an IDF-designated safe zone. Keeping in mind that over the last 11 months, we've seen Israel over and over again play this game of genocidal musical chairs, telling people from the north to go to the south, and that will be the safe zone, and then they tell them to go to Khan Yunis, and then whoops, now we're going to invade Khan Yunis, go to Rafah, and now we're going to invade Rafah, go to Mawasi, and oops, now we have to do strikes in Mawasi as well. The reality here is that there was never a safe zone. There is no safe zone in Gaza. They have been obliterating the entirety of the strip. So here were some of the details. They say an Israeli strike hit a crowded Palestinian tent camp early Tuesday in Gaza, killing at least 19 people and wounding 60, Palestinian officials said. Israel, of course, said that it targeted senior Hamas militants with precise munitions. Does this look like a precise munition here to you guys? You can see some of the people standing up here at the top. This looks to be, 20, 30 feet craters that they've created in a densely populated refugee camp housing innocent men, women, children. Does that look like a precise strike against Hamas militants? That's not what it looks like to me. Now, keep in mind again, they say this in this piece as well, but it's something that you could probably guess. Israel has not provided any sort of lick of evidence that they did intend to target any sort of Hamas militants or that those targetings were successful. Not to say that even if that claim was accurate, that it would somehow be justified under international law and that it wouldn't be a violation of international law in order to engage in this kind of strike, killing dozens of people, wounding dozens more in order to target some alleged Hamas militants, right? And we know exactly how the IDF has been classifying Hamas militants. It's basically anybody who is above the age of about 15 and happens to be a male in Gaza. That's how they do that classification. They continue, though. They say, the strike occurred in Mawasi, a sprawl of camps along the coast that Israel designated as a humanitarian zone for hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians to seek shelter from the nearly year-old Israel-Hamas war, which I think obviously is more accurately classified as a genocide. But I want you guys to keep in mind, hundreds of thousands of people were forced into this tiny little enclave in Mawasi. Guys, this is an area that has previously been compared to like the size of a large airport, right? With extremely limited, if any at all, resources for people there. The idea that this place in Mawasi, in and of itself, even if it was a perfect humanitarian zone and the IDF wasn't striking it, the idea that this place is capable of housing hundreds of thousands of displaced people is utter insanity in and of itself. But of course, they continue with the strikes there on top of that. They say Associated Press videos showed 3 large craters, and first responders dug with garden tools and bare hands using mobile phone flashlights until the sun came up. They pulled body parts from the sand, including what appeared to be a human leg. And here's a quote. They say, "We were told to go to Mawasi, to the safe area, look around you and see if this is a safe place," said Iyad Mahdi, who had been sheltering there. They also said, "This is for my son," holding up a bag of diapers. "He's 4 months old. Is he a fighter? There is no humanity." Now, some further context here, but before we get to some more of the imagery, they say the war has caused vast destruction and displaced around 90% of Gaza's population of 2.3 million, often multiple times. Israeli evacuation orders, which now cover around 90% of the territory, have pushed hundreds of thousands of people into Mawasi, where aid groups have struggled to provide even basic services. Again, keeping in mind that the IDF has been targeting and blocking many of these aid services by themselves. But again, 90% of Gaza's population of 2.3 million displaced. 90% of the territory is under an evacuation order. Guys, before October 7th, Gaza was already one of the most densely populated places on the face of the planet. Half the population there is children, right? So you took what is already one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and then you condensed them into 10% of the territory, because the other 90% has evacuation orders, and then even in that 10%, you're continuing to do strikes. They say Gaza's health ministry says over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed since the war began. The ministry does not distinguish between civilians and militants in its count, but says that women and children make up just over half of the dead. Majority of the people being killed are women and children. Israel says that it has killed more than 17,000 militants in the war, which, if you've been keeping up with this, should seem absolutely preposterous, because it is. This is not true. The math is not adding up here, unless I guess you count, again, every single adult male that they have killed to be a Hamas militant, which we know is not true. Now, this 41,000 number is roughly the same number that we've been seeing month after month after month, which I think should give you an indication that it's a drastic undercount, because as we can see from this story and from many others that I've covered on the channel, these massacres are continuing on a daily basis. You see different stories of dozens of Palestinians being killed. So there is no chance that the number is still at around 41,000. It has to be an undercount. Now, in terms of previous other examples, as well as this one, of Israel striking supposed safe zones, here is pointed out by Al Jazeera, just some recent examples. September 10th, at least 19 were killed in one of these strikes. July 13th, at least 90 were killed. June 22nd, at least 25 were killed. May 28th, 21 were killed. And March 26th, 12 were killed. These are just some examples of Israel targeting safe zones over and over and over again. Now, again, some images from what this actually looked like on the ground. We have this one. We also have some images of what the burning tents, many of which you would presume had some people inside of them, what this looked like. And again, you get to see some of the images of the craters here. Now, again, I mean, look, these are full-sized adults here, standing at the top of these craters. There are human beings within the sand surrounding this crater. Look at the size of that. And then think about the IDF claiming that this is a precise strike against Hamas militants. Here we have some video of people who were there on the ground trying to dig out potentially their family members, potentially their friends, potentially people they don't know, but trying to dig people out with their bare hands from this massive crater that Israel created. Now, we also had some reporting here from CNN. Let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this. I'll put it on 1.25 times speed and hear a little bit more on some of the details here.
Eyewitnesses say the Israeli strikes targeted what was meant to be a safe zone in the southern Gaza Strip, ripping through tents and makeshift shelters, leaving deep craters, and dozens have killed and injured. They told us this area was safe, says this man. I swear the people here were just normal, he says, not fighters. By daylight, you can see the extent of the destruction. Israel's military says it conducted a precise strike on Hamas terrorists, operating a command and control centre inside this humanitarian zone. An IDF statement says, prior to the strike, numerous steps were taken to mitigate the risk of harming civilians. But this was a heavily populated area, and civilians were caught up in the powerful blasts. This man says his two daughters were completely buried under the sand. Only one survived, he says, and he says he found the body parts of his neighbours strewn around. This 12-year-old girl is nursing a broken shoulder, suffered when her tent collapsed, she says, trapping her and her mother inside. I was scared because the strikes were so close, she says. Allahu Akbar! Israel accuses Hamas of using civilians as human shields and insists the Israeli military takes extensive measures to enable civilians in Gaza to avoid combat zones.
Just think about that side by side there, right? In terms of what he's saying, the IDF is claiming, versus the images that you are seeing on screen. Oh, it was a targeted strike. We took every step imaginable in order to prevent civilians from being caught up in this. I mean, just there at the end, claiming, let's listen to it one more time so you can hear how insane it is. One more time.
Allahu Akbar! Israel accuses Hamas of using civilians as human shields and insists the Israeli military takes extensive measures to enable civilians in Gaza to avoid combat zones.
They take extensive measures to allow civilians to avoid combat zones. Guys, what did we just read? What did we just read from the Associated Press? 90% of Gaza is under evacuation orders. 10% is left, and this strike took place even in that 10%. And this is not the first time that that's happened. How do you say you're taking every step imaginable to allow civilians to escape combat zones when you've made the entirety of the Gaza Strip a combat zone? How does that square? It doesn't. It obviously doesn't. And to anybody with a fucking brain at this point, that should be ringing some alarm bells, showing some red flags, right? Because that doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense when you come to the understanding that this is not a targeted operation against Hamas, and it never has been. This has been a collective punishment campaign, one of the most obvious genocides in modern history. That's what this has been. 11 months straight of this. Many of the weapons that are being used against these civilians, by the way, as a reminder, coming straight from the United States of America. My country, my government, the Biden administration, presumably would continue under the Kamala Harris or the Donald Trump administration. This is U.S. foreign policy for you. Some imagery we also had released recently. Now, remind yourselves, this is Rafah, right? At the southern tip of Gaza. And remind yourself that a large-scale invasion of Rafah was Joe Biden's supposed red line. He said, well, if they do a large invasion of Rafah, then maybe we'll consider cutting off the weapons to Israel, right? Here's a before and after. Before and after. I guess we are to believe that this is not a large-scale invasion of Rafah. Now, moving on, we also have some updates here from the United Nations and from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Here from Mohammed, he says the UN says that the UN-run school shelter that was bombed today by Israel not only killed several UN staff, but that this was the 6th time that Israel has bombed this specific shelter. So some more details on that here directly from UNRWA. They say 6 UNRWA colleagues were killed today when 2 airstrikes hit a school and its surroundings in the Nusrayat, in the middle areas of Gaza. This is the highest death toll among our staff in a single incident. Among those killed was the manager of the UNRWA shelter and other team members providing assistance to displaced people. Sincere condolences to the families and the loved ones. This school has been hit 5 times since the war began. It is home to around 12,000 displaced people, mainly women and children. No one is safe in Gaza. No one is spared. Schools and other civilian infrastructure must be protected at all times. They are not a target. We call on all parties of the conflict to never use schools or the areas around them for military or for fighting purposes. We also had a separate incident in which a UN convoy was stopped by Israeli forces. This took place 2 days ago on September 10th. And as pointed out here by Beeson, the details of this are stunning, right? Not shocking, but stunning, right? That this is a normal occurrence. The convoy was carrying 12 UN staff members on their way to support the polio vaccination campaign in northern Gaza, keeping in mind that the only reason that there is a need for a polio vaccination campaign in Gaza is because of the offensive in and of itself, because Israel has not been allowing in adequate food, water, medical supplies, and they have obliterated the shelter and the places that displaced people can go, right? So when you set up that kind of a situation, there is going to be a significant increase in the likelihood for the spread of diseases or outbreaks of diseases like polio, right? And there are many other diseases as well that have been going around Gaza, disproportionately affecting children, by the way. But so this was a convoy of UN staff members who were trying to support this polio vaccination campaign in the north. They say its movement was fully coordinated with Israeli forces. Sound familiar? With all details provided ahead of time. When the team was stopped at the Al Rashid checkpoint, they were informed that Israeli forces wanted to hold 2 of the UN staff members in the convoy for questioning. The situation escalated quickly, with soldiers pointing their weapons directly towards the UN personnel in the convoy. The UN vehicles were then encircled by Israeli forces, and shots were fired. The convoy was then approached by IDF tanks and bulldozers, which proceeded to ram the UN vehicles from the back and the front, compacting the convoy with the UN staff still inside. They say one bulldozer dropped debris on the first vehicle while Israeli soldiers threatened the staff, making it impossible for them to safely exit the vehicles. The convoy remained at gunpoint as senior UN officials engaged with Israeli authorities to de-escalate the situation. The two staff were interrogated and then released. Guys, this took place 7.5 hours at the checkpoint. 7.5 hours. And then the convoy had to return to the base after being unable to complete its humanitarian mission. So they are stopping UN convoys that are trying to go to vaccinate children so that they don't die of an entirely preventable disease like polio. And they're stopping this convoy, surrounding them, shooting live ammo, pointing guns at them, threatening them, bulldozing into the cars, compacting them, and preventing them from going and completing their humanitarian mission. This is like a normal thing, right? At this point, given what we've covered over the last 11 months, this is not even shocking. It should be in a reasonable world, in a world where we gave a shit about war crimes, about, humanitarianism, if we cared about international law, then this would be shocking to everybody. This would be a national scandal, right? If it was Russia doing something similar in Ukraine, it would be. The U.S. would make sure that it was. But when it comes to our close ally Israel, the people we are funding and arming and giving diplomatic cover to, then this is a nothing burger. This is something the mainstream U.S. media won't talk about. This is something Biden won't comment on. You have to, at this point, even just to get a comment from Biden or from Kamala, you have to kill an American at this point. And even then, it'll take multiple days to get some sort of a comment. And then they'll try to whitewash the IDF's actions, even when they kill fucking American citizens. So to elaborate on that and exactly what I mean here, if you guys remember, a couple days ago, I covered the story of Asinur Igi, who was a U.S. citizen killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank, not in Gaza, in the West Bank. And she was there to help to protest and to fight back against the ongoing illegal settlement expansion process in the West Bank, where Palestinians are faced with a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing, right? And so this was the claim from Joe Biden to reporters. He says, apparently it was an accident. It was an accident. Ricocheted off the ground, and she just got hit by accident. I'm working that out now. A bullet ricocheted off the ground and hit her by accident. Really? Really? How many times do we have to go through this exact same kind of a situation before it is no longer an accident? How many times? Now, I told you guys, and maybe I should play the clip in this just to demonstrate the point here, not to brag on myself, but just to prove how easy this is to predict these kinds of things. But in my video where I was covering this originally, what did I tell you guys? I said we were going to be faced with a couple of days or weeks or maybe even a couple of months of lies from the IDF, different variations of stories from the IDF and from the U.S. State Department, and then eventually down the line, after much of the U.S. media has moved on from it, we would get some sort of an investigation. I believe I specifically said from either the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they would debunk the Israeli lies about this story. So here we have, side by side, this is just a couple days later, guys, from CNN, Biden backs Israel's claim that the IDF killing of American activists in the West Bank was accidental. Whoops, here from the Washington Post. New video, witnesses challenge Israel's account of U.S. activists killing. The IDF said that Asinur Igi was shot unintentionally during a violent riot, and a post-analysis shows clashes had subsided and protesters had retreated. Now, keep in mind, guys, again, what was she there doing, right? This was, as far as I know, a largely peaceful protest. And what were they protesting? They were protesting the completely illegal and criminal expansion of settlements in the West Bank. So who's in the right here? Just in a broad scope sense, right? If you want to get down to it, who has a right to even potentially engage in some sort of resistance or some sort of violence in this instance? Is it the IDF? Do you have a right as an illegal occupying force to shoot at protesters who are protesting your illegal occupation? No, you don't. Regardless of whether or not it's an American or it's a Palestinian or it's anybody. who is trying to protest that. You have no right to be shooting at these protesters, point blank, period. Now, the claim from the IDF is like, supposedly, IDF soldiers who were hundreds of feet away felt threatened because they thought a rock was going to be thrown, and so they had to fire live ammunition at these protesters who, as pointed out here, had already retreated. There is no excuse for this. Again, regardless of whether or not this happens to be an American. This one got more attention because it is an American, but it really shouldn't be getting more attention. It shouldn't be. Now, we have another post here from Matt. He says, so the official explanation is that Asener and the other protesters were hurling rocks, causing an Israeli sniper who was 2 football fields away to fear for his safety and fire, accidentally executing the wrong political dissident. And as he points out here, the Hasbara, it's bad. It's not even good from a propaganda standpoint. Like, they can't even at this point, they're so far gone that they can't even come up with remotely believable explanations. So I'm supposed to believe there was a protest that broke out against the expansion of these illegal settlements. And you guys were so threatened, these IDF soldiers were so threatened 2 football fields away by people throwing rocks that they had no choice but to fire live ammunition in self-defense. And one of those bullets, whoops, happened to execute the wrong person. Well, we meant to execute somebody else, right? One of the instigators of the riot, not this American. We meant to execute somebody else. They have every right in the world under international law to resist the Israeli occupation. In the same way, you know, if I want to use the language here of the U.S. State Department, in the same exact way that Ukrainians have the right to resist Russian troops who are coming in and illegally occupying their land, right? I mean, I want you just think about the parallels here, right? Imagine the U.S. government running cover for the Russian military if a Russian soldier shot a Ukrainian civilian because that Russian soldier thought the Ukrainian civilian was going to throw a rock at them. Imagine it's an American Ukrainian. Do you think in a million fucking years that the U.S. State Department, that the President of the United States would run cover for them, would believe the Russian narrative on that? Never in a million years would they do that. It's only for Israel that they would do that kind of a thing. Now we also have this here from Antonio Guterres. The level of suffering we are witnessing in Gaza is unprecedented in my mandate as the Secretary General of the United Nations. I've never seen such a level of death and destruction as we are seeing in Gaza in the last few months. This is the Secretary General of the United Nations saying this, who obviously has a purview over many other conflicts that have happened throughout recent history and are happening right now around the world. The worst death and destruction that he has seen. Now, this is also going to eventually, and I've covered this angle multiple times before, backfire on Israel. This is Israeli economist Shir Hever saying that Israel's genocidal war has bankrupted its economy and destroyed the country's future. 46,000 businesses have gone bankrupt, and up to 60,000 will close by the end of the year. Foreign investment has dropped by 60%. There is no tourism, I think for obvious reasons. Education system has collapsed. Doctors have left the country. Millions have returned to their homes in Europe. And the tech industry, Israel's largest, has slumped 56%, and Intel canceled that $25 billion project. So even from an Israeli perspective, you should be fucking pissed at Benjamin Netanyahu. You should be pissed at your government for engaging in not only this ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, but also the genocide in Gaza. Because this is screwing you over in the long term as well. Right? This is not helping you in the long term. You have become a global pariah state. Most of the world at this point thinks of Israel as the rogue state that they are, committing a genocide, committing an apartheid. That's most of the world. We're insulated here in the United States and in many other Western European governments or countries. We're insulated because of the narrative that we hear from our politicians and from the media. And so we don't see that as much as the rest of the world does. But that's the reality. This is Zionism coming to its final conclusion and imploding in on itself in a fascist, dystopian way, where not only you're doing the genocide and the ethnic cleansing, but you're also destroying your own project here, right? And a lot of this, as a reminder, is just to protect Benjamin Netanyahu as an individual. Not to say that if it was a different Israeli prime minister that things wouldn't be roughly the same as they are right now, but specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, to protect his own political career, to protect his own future, has every incentive in the world to keep the genocide going. Because the second that he ends it, if he ever agreed to some sort of a ceasefire deal, then his government is going to fracture and collapse, and that will be the end of him. And so he understands that. And so we've had to deal with months at this point of the most obvious sabotage of these ceasefire deals that I've ever seen. And we, at the same time, are having to deal with the U.S. government pretending as if, no, it's actually Hamas that's sabotaging the deal, even though they very clearly stated multiple times that they agreed to the deal that Joe Biden was putting forward. And now it's Benjamin Netanyahu tacking on new thing after new thing after new thing and committing massacre after massacre after massacre in order to sabotage it. This is what we've been seeing for months at this point, guys. None of this should be unclear to anybody at this point. How many more UN workers need to be killed? How many more journalists? How many more American citizens? How many more Palestinian children need to be vaporized, need to be sacrificed at the altar of Benjamin Netanyahu's career, need to be sacrificed at the altar of this apartheid, this genocidal state that we are continuing to arm, to fund, and to give cover for?
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying